origin of this day, Halloween, it dates back to some 2,000 years ago to the Celtic festival of Samhain that marked the end of the summer harvest and the beginning of the cold, dark winter. So on this day, the Celts believed that the veil between life and death was at its thinnest, and that those who have previously departed could come back into this world. And so they would celebrate with bonfires and dress up in costumes. Christians, of course, would later adapt the celebration for All Saints Day and All Souls Day as a time to remember the saints and the martyrs of the faith. All Saints Day became All Hallows Eve, which eventually became what we now know as Halloween. So here in the U.S., we use the day to dress up in costumes, eat a lot of candy, and go to parties. The underlying purpose of this tradition, however, is to mark the change in the seasons, but also to bring awareness to the precariousness of this physical life, whether it is the fragility of our crops or our farm animals or our own human flesh. Among our top list of fears, however, many of them are related to death, such as losing a loved one or mass shootings or terrorism or becoming terminally ill. For all that fear, though, we do a pretty good job of simply ignoring death, feeling like we got all the time in the world. That darkness of denying death is what ultimately keeps us afraid of it. We can see through that darkness, though, when we realize that death is not really the worst thing that could ever happen to us. Living in fear is probably the worst fate that we could ever encounter. Today, we're going to talk about how to turn our fear around, because when we can encounter love, despite our fear of all things death-related, we will make way for the holy to show us a whole new way to really live that will make all of us say, "Oh yeah." Back many years when I was teaching a comparative religion class at Midlands Tech, the final assignment was the much dreaded group project where students had to invent their own religion. And their religions had to have everything religions have. They had to have a founder, dogma and doctrines, styles of worship and gathering, initiation rituals, and the all-important question of whether the religion embraced an afterlife, some sort of afterlife, whether it was a heaven, hell, purgatory, or maybe reincarnation. So students, of course, grumbled about the project. That was the fun part for me. Being on the other end, I could, yeah. But, many of them came up with some really brilliant religions based on everything from football, which was kind of a gimme, that football, shopping, capitalism itself. They crafted religions around all of these things. And they were all valid forms of religious concepts and beliefs, but curiously, out of all of the ones that I did during these times that I was teaching, there was one thing missing from every single religion these students came up with. Any guesses? I heard it back here. Hell. There was no hell. There was no eternal punishment in any of the religions. In fact, the majority, you guys probably get this, the majority of the religions they invented had some form of what?
Heaven?
Reincarnation. That's it. A promise that you would come back and do this all again, only you can try to get better at it next time. I'm with you, Deb. I didn't want to come back. I was curious about this, so I quizzed them. And the answer that I got most often from these students was not that they were afraid of death per se, because every single one of their religions embraced the fact that our bodies would die, but what every student feared was one thing: annihilation. They were afraid that their lives would end by being cast into some black nothingness, and more importantly, in this world, they would be forgotten. And I told them, annihilation sounded like heaven to me. I mean, you're not going to know anything. You don't know whether you've even been there, done that, and been remembered or got the t-shirt. You don't know. Why would it matter? But this fear was very deep within my students. And it seems that fear over what happens after this bodily life is over is pretty common, not just a fear of annihilation, but there are some people who suffer from apeirophobia, which is the fear of an eternal life that goes on forever and ever without an end or an amen. Wow. I know. I think, though, the problem of our fears stems from how we think about consciousness, either in annihilation or eternal existence. Our ego has us convinced that no matter where we go, into oblivion or some eternal heaven, we will still exist as we are right now, with our likes and our dislikes and our stories and our thoughts and our feelings and our beliefs. And from that point of view, I can see why it would cause so much fear and loathing. I don't want to be this me forever. That sounds like hell. I mean, come on. I like me well enough, but how terrifyingly boring would it be to be this me forever and ever? Oh my God. So A Course in Miracles gives us a different way of thinking about the consciousness that inhabits not just our bodies, but the bodies of everyone we see around us and those we believe are separate entities from us. And it assures us that neither annihilation nor an eternity as these egos will be our ultimate fate. The Course says this morning, complete unconsciousness is impossible. So annihilation is off the table. It just doesn't happen. This chapter also tells us that rest in peace should be a blessing for the living, not the dead, because it says rest comes from waking, not from sleeping. By keeping us asleep, the ego keeps us gripped in this fear about death, a kind of death that can never really happen to us. Since whether you're afraid of it or not, we're already eternal beings. We already remain in the realm of the holy, even as we experience this bodily world. So awakening to the truth about ourselves as blessed eternal beings is the worst thing that can happen to the ego, because of our fear of annihilation, or even our fear of eternal life, will disappear. Because the Course says you can rest in peace only because you are awake. Because you're not being driven by the ego anymore that makes you live in fear and terror and exhaustion. The fear of complete unconsciousness or annihilation is one of being forgotten. And our ego does all it can to convince us that our function here is to make some lasting mark on the world before we leave our bodily form so we can be remembered. And there are many traditions in this area, in this idea of remembrance. If you're driving around and you see some sticker of somebody who is in remembrance, of a loved one, their date of birth, their date of death. It's very big in African American communities. They believe that that is how people are kept alive, by being remembered. Even Jesus instructs us to enjoy communion in remembrance of him, and we've done a pretty good job at keeping his name front and center in the culture for thousands and thousands of years. The ego, though, it convinces us that making our mark on this world requires hard work. There is no rest for the weary ego. There is no west. You can forget about it. California, it's gone. But the ego says you got to work hard. There's no rest for you. So some of us employ some benign ways to accomplish our worldly immortality. We want to write the great American novel. We want to cure cancer. We want to become a rock star or some other celebrity. We want to be a popular social media influencer these days, a great teacher or some sort, or leader. But others go in the opposite direction, claiming fame for themselves by becoming thieves or autocrats or dictators or corrupt politicians or mass murderers. So this is the ego setting a choice before you. You can be Martin Luther King Jr. or you can be Charles Manson. It doesn't matter to the ego. Its goal is for you to work hard to be somebody, and it doesn't care about the specifics. It just wants you to work hard at it. Lily Tomlin had a great line. She said, "I always wanted to be somebody. Now I realize I should have been more specific." And that's why rest in peace is a blessing for the living. Because you get specific. You don't want what the ego wants anymore. Those of us who are sleeping, though, when we're living from that unconscious ego, we're out there striving for wind, as the Ecclesiastes puts it, motivated by fear of dying to the memory of this illusory world by gaining some manner of illusory fame. It's crazy. We exhaust ourselves in the process. We strive for something, anything, to just be remembered when these bodies wither and die. That's why we fear the reaper so much. We believe we have to physically die before we can rest in peace. And paradoxically, we believe we can't achieve peace until we achieve something meaningful in this world. So what we fear, really, is not so much a physical death, but something much worse. The death of the ego. If we ever truly muster the courage we need to awaken to that higher divine self. Breathe deeply. When I first began studying A Course in Miracles, I was really unsettled by its insistence that death does not exist. Now, I thought this was demonstrably untrue, given that every single one of us experience a physical death. What I've realized is, though, that the death that the Course says is impossible is the death of our higher divine self. The ego, though, convinces us that there is no such thing as that higher divine self, and to believe in such a thing that is eternal and timeless and changeless is insanity. And I got to admit, the ego has some pretty good arguments against this higher divine self mumbo-jumbo. The ego can show us countless ways that we can die in this world. And it can make endless and convincing arguments about how woo-woo and ridiculous it sounds to even talk about a higher divine self that you can't see, you can't hear, you can't touch it or taste it or smell it. And this, of course, is where we go off track, trusting the ego's bodily senses to tell us anything about the true world of spirit. The ego's tell, though, is this. You know, everybody on a poker table has a tell. So the ego's tell is we're not so much afraid of physical death as we are afraid of the little deaths that we die every day. Those mental and psychological and emotional deaths we encounter when we feel shamed or abandoned or lonely or fearful, powerless or marginalized in some way. And that's because the death we fear is to those things that our ego has convinced us are our true identity. Our ego has convinced us this is who we are. So the ego, it's not really afraid of your physical death. It doesn't care whether you live or die. It's afraid of its death as the creator and the driver of your identity. And that's exactly why Jesus talks about the necessity of that grain of wheat falling and dying to bring forth new and abundant life. He's talking about why we must embrace those moments when our egoic identities die. We have to seek them out. In fact, find those patterns of ego that are ruling us, that are becoming our identities, and die to those identities. Because the moment that we allow the egoic death occur is when we become fruitful. You know, my ego once told me, back in my 20s, the most fearful thing that could happen to me, this would be a death to me, was that people would find out I was a lesbian. It's laughable now, right? But I was afraid. Back then, I was so scared because I was raised a Southern Baptist. I was an abomination. That's what I thought. And I was afraid that those I loved would hate me, that they would abandon me, and that those I didn't know would reject me outright, maybe do some form of violence to me. So I spent decades locked in a closet of fear and loathing. But my ability to die to that fear has produced much good fruit, including an online spiritual magazine that I started for LGBTQ people back in 1996, a book I published years later based on that, years of activism in the LGBTQ equality movement that has helped others die to their own egoic fear of coming out and embracing their healing in their sexuality and spirituality. Now, I rest in peace with my sexuality and my spirituality. There's no one who can take that peace away from me. And it came about only because I was willing to allow my ego's fears about coming out to fall away and die. And that is the death that does not exist. The ego's insistence that we will die if people know our secrets, that they will abandon us in some way. The ego wants to keep us asleep in that darkness of fear, that place where there is no true peace, where there is only exhaustion. The Apostle Paul, in his first letter to the early Jesus followers in Corinth, he makes this argument, even back then, that the death our ego says exists isn't real. He likens the ego to what is sown, which is perishable. But he says what is raised is imperishable. Now, when we go look at the Greek, it gets fun. What is sown is always in darkness. That's the seed that is asleep. What is raised, though, according to the Greek word, agyro, here's your Greek lesson, agyro. That Greek word means awake. That's a euro. It's a little different, right? Would like an agyro, please. Heavy on the tzatziki. But Paul is literally telling his followers and us today that only our sleeping ego can die. But what is eternal is what is awake. Jubilance within each of us is a higher divine self that is awake. It is already eternal. Our ego, Paul says, is sown. It is planted in this physical body, but it is raised or awakened in our spiritual body, which we also have in this moment. We were created, Paul says, as Adam, or Adam, which doesn't mean just one guy. It means humankind. So Adam is created as living bodies, but our higher divine self, he says, is that life-giving spirit. We have both a body and a spirit. And when we realize this, when we overcome our fear of our perishable body and put on what he calls imperishability, then the ego's false death will be swallowed up in victory. When we see through the darkness of death and realize that it's simply something the ego fears and does not affect who we truly are, then we understand that death, like everything else in this world, is just an illusion. Death does not and will never give us peace. Only awakening can do that. So how do we awaken? We awaken when we understand. Remember, my students said they were afraid that they weren't going to be remembered. So we awaken when we understand our purpose in this life is not to strive to be remembered. Instead, our function is to remember. It's to remember who we truly are. We are the light of the world. Then we are to remember that we are here to shine that light of holy love in every moment so others will remember who they are. When enough of us stop trying to be remembered and instead we remember, then we shine our light together. There'll be no reason to fear the reaper because the ego's game of death will be over. So when we remember who we truly are, jubilants, that ultimate ego fear of not being remembered is gone. Why? Because we are creations of the holy and we are always remembered because we have never left the mind of God. The ego's dream is to be remembered in an illusory world, but the good news, jubilants, is that we are already remembered by our Creator in eternity, in that true capital R reality that never ends. This bodily life, jubilance, it's about remembering. If you remember who you truly are while you are in this world, then you will change this world because you will be part of creating that happy dream that helps us all to finally awaken. Remembering who we are and remembering those we perceive as separate from ourselves are also extensions of the holy, is how we heal and save this world. In that remembering, in your remembering, you help others remember. And the more who awaken and rest in peace, and the faster we all awaken. Our mission, though, is not to be remembered for our money or our fame or our power or influence in the world, but whether or not we formed deep relationships with one another. How many lives we changed and healed with the holy love that comes through us when we touch and live into that spacious awareness that is our higher divine self. This is a measure of success. It's not selfish or an act of spiritual bypass to work on your own awakening. Instead, awakening is the one thing you can do that makes the biggest difference in the world because it helps others to awaken as well. If you awaken and you touch that spacious awareness within, then you become that awakened person. You still got your own history. You still got your life and your stories and your job and the people that you love, but you will rest in peace while you are still alive because you have allowed the ego's fear to fall away from you and die. And what grows in its place, Paul tells us, is a life-giving spirit that emanates from your very being. Jubilance. There's no reason to fear the reaper because we are all part of that eternal wholeness that flows without beginning or without end. And I don't know what else in the world could make you say, oh, yeah.